Hey, good morning, and thank you for joining us. So my name is Alexis Stokes. I'm the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences.
And I'm Pamela Pollock. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the Bach Center for Teaching and Learning, and I oversee all of our programming and support for graduate students, PhD students in the FAS. And we're so excited to be here today to share this breakout session. So here's just a reminder of the framing of the session. Basically, we want to just review and discuss and explore some foundational ideas and frameworks in the vein of how you create an inclusive climate in the classroom. And then we're going to spend most of our session today with discussing scenarios, real scenarios taken from things that are happening this term, for us to really think about how we can be supporting students during these challenging times. So yeah, you can see our agenda here. At the beginning, we're just going to give some foundational ideas. And as we're doing that, we know that many of you have a lot of expertise as well. We'll invite you to share your ideas in the chat as we're going for some of these different topics. And then we'll move into breakout discussions.
So before we get into the content for today, we wanted to take some time and kind of go over some norms. And if there are other norms that you would like to see be a part of our discussion today, feel free to add those to the chat, and we will make note of those to make sure that we are following those norms. So we want to encourage you to share resources and ideas in the chat. We will also be doing that, of sharing resources within the chat. So as we're going over things, there may be documents and references that you're familiar with and have been helpful to you. So feel free to drop those into the chat. If you have a question, you can do the raise hand feature, or you can put those questions in the chat, and we will try to monitor the chat for those questions. As we're discussing today, and when you're in your breakout rooms in the second part of the session, we encourage you to please use I statements and avoid generalizing comments. Remain on mute unless you're speaking to the group, so that we can ensure that everyone is able to hear everyone speaking. We will put a link in the chat. Pamela will put a link in the chat that we do have a session handout. This will allow you to follow along with our presentation. You'll see some of the resources we already have linked to within that handout based on what we're discussing today. And then also for the breakout rooms, consider adding your school unit or affiliation to your Zoom name. You can click the 3 dots in the corner of your picture to edit your name. This will just kind of help everyone to see how much of Harvard is represented in our kind of small community today within our session. So we will start with setting the tone and the syllabus, the role of the syllabus in really setting expectations of how the course will progress throughout the semester, but then also expectations about how you will be communicating with your students and how you would like for them to communicate with you. Also, how you would like for your TF staff to be communicating with students and how they can communicate with TFs. So conveying these expectations could look like how to ask questions during the course time frame. Do you want students to just unmute themselves and start speaking? Do you want them to send it in the chat privately to you or to a TF? Kind of what are those expectations? How will office hours look? What are office hours? As Professor Tony Jack mentioned in the session earlier around explaining what are office hours. So you might think, you know, this session was really geared towards responding when things happen, but we wanted to take a step back and say, how can we set the tone and the expectations in anticipation that something will happen? So we know a lot of things are coming up this semester, but even in the semester where we're on campus, not amidst a health pandemic, we're always really amidst a pandemic with regard to racism, but how can we set the expectation of how we're going to communicate with each other? You can add to your syllabus a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. You can actually include the commitment statement from your school or unit, and then your own personal commitment statement. And I do encourage you to write your own personal commitment statement and not just copy the commitment statement from your school. Also, don't assume that students know. So this is something that Professor Jack was speaking about in his comments this morning, and that there is a hidden curriculum of academia and navigating our institutions. So don't assume that the acronyms that you're using, don't assume the offices that you're referencing, or that office hours, or using TF, that your students are familiar with what you are saying. Take the time on that first day, and even in your syllabus, to really take the time to explain those things and allow time for questions. And then how do you set the tone with regard to belonging and community, and that you as the faculty member or as the teacher is prioritizing that in your classroom? So one is to acknowledge the circumstances that we are currently in, but then also acknowledge that we all come to the classroom with various identities. Take the time to get to know your students. So what does this look like to get to know your students? This might be that you, on that first day, you're not there to teach. We're just going to take the time. We're going to do some icebreaker activities. We're going to go into breakout rooms, introduce ourselves, get to know each other. I'll go into detail a little in a couple of slides down the road of different activities that you can do around building community, but making sure you also take the time to assess needs and concerns. So when we say assess needs, where, do your students have internet? Do they need a hotspot? If you are talking about a course that is a lab-based course, and you may have built certain activities, making sure you didn't assume that students would have access to those things at home. So assessing based on what the curriculum, based on what you're going to be teaching, what are those needs and what are some of the concerns students have? I sometimes will spend time just having one moment in course that's just burning questions. And it's just space and opportunity for students to ask the questions they had coming in. They can put them into the chat. They can message me privately. They can use the office hours for that time, but just making sure there's designated time and space for what are those burning questions that they might be concerned about. And again, outline the engagement opportunities. Are there going to be discussion threads? Are we going to be using Slack? Are we going to do different kind of social hours to get to know each other? Are you going to have a podcast? What are those engagement opportunities? So setting that tone on the first day, as well as you can put these things in the syllabus, and then communicating your support and flexibility. So we might think that that's just a small thing to take the time to say on that first day, that you're acknowledging the circumstances, you're there to support them and be flexible, but those words themselves can go an extremely long way.
Yeah, and I'll just take a minute to jump in here with some more formal ways you can think about on your syllabus and as you're setting the tone in your class, whether you're using a formal classroom contract or a group agreement. And you'll see some resources in your handout just linking to more information about those. But just as Alexis is saying about making these things explicit, the main idea of classroom contracts is what are kind of these unwritten rules of the class, and how can you sort of spell them out and make your syllabus as comprehensive as possible with like what the expectations are. The example from this morning that Anthony Jack used was the office hours. That's one great example, but just what are, as much as you can, how does the syllabus communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it? And group agreements are really the time to talk with the class about that. Like, what are the norms that you want to create in the class and have students be on board with? Again, with this effort of everyone sort of understanding what is the enterprise of the class, what are we doing and why, and what is expected, so that everyone's on the same page.
So when we talk about building community, these are some examples of things that you can do. Prior to the start of the semester, maybe during shopping week, once students start to register for the course, you can ask all of the students to post a bio, post a photo onto the course site so that they can start to get to know each other. They can start to see, have you yourself to do the same, have your TF staff to do the same, and include in your bios and ask your TFs to do the same too. In the bio, don't just talk about here are the degrees I have, here are my research areas, but also share if you have pets, share information about your family, share information about you enjoy traveling or you enjoy cooking, kind of what your interests are, so that students can begin to connect with you. And then by also posting the bios and the photos, you're starting to set that expectation of, we are a community, we're going to spend a lot of time together this semester, and we want to get to know, I want to get to know you, and I want you to get to know me. Thinking about, again, those engagement opportunities, Can you create discussion threads and blogs and podcasts? We've seen some faculty this semester and last semester actually create podcasts as a way where they interviewed people in the field and then had students to watch those podcasts. And maybe that was an opportunity to write a reflection paper for students to really start to think about what are my interests within this field? How am I responding to these very critical issues that are related to the curriculum that I'm learning? Dedicating time for introductions on that first day. Are there icebreakers that you can use? I've sometimes within sessions, I've asked people to bring something, with them that was important on that first day, and then taking the time to, if of course these are in reference examples of things that can be done when it's a smaller class and you have that time, but saying, take the time to say your name, what's your concentration, and then explain the artifact or the object that you brought with you and why this is important to your identity. I've also said, change your virtual background to something that represents your personality, represents your identity, your community. Setting the community norms together as well. And as I said, time for those burning questions. Solicit feedback often and using different methods, and Pamela will go into examples of how you can collect that feedback. Also, utilizing the How I Say My Name feature in My.Harvard. And so taking the time before courses to go into My.Harvard, the students that have enrolled in your course, listening to how to pronounce their name. So when you are in class, you are able to say their name correctly, and that in itself starts to build community and sends a message to the student that my faculty member really cares and understands the importance of how my name is even connected to my community and connected to my identity. So those opportunities for engagement, you can do community groups with your TF staff. So this is really good for those larger courses, is to assign a certain number of students to a TF. And then you have designated kind of community building times that the TF is going to meet with those students. Maybe aspects of the course come up in the curriculum and P sets that they're having trouble with, but then sometimes maybe it's just an opportunity to get to know each other and talk about things that are trending on Twitter, and talk about kind of things that they're interested in, how the semester is going for them, what are some of the concerns and challenges that they may be experiencing. Having open office hours with continuous reminders. So a lot of times what we'll do is put those office hours on our syllabus and then we don't mention them again. But making sure that we're reminding our students throughout the semester that those office hours are there, they're open, they can also schedule time to meet with you, but dedicate some time to stay logged on after class as well. So we had that opportunity when we were in person that you may kind of stand around in the class after you're finished teaching, or students can walk with you back to your office, but we don't have that now. So putting time in your schedule that for 15, 30 minutes after your class is out, you're gonna remain in that Zoom room. Your TF staff is gonna remain in that Zoom room so that you can answer questions. How can you utilize Slack? Drop into sections or the community groups that your TFs are having. May have that schedule available to you as the faculty member to then say, I'm just gonna drop in to different ones so that the students see I myself am very engaged, which again sets that expectation that I'm expecting you to also be engaged, and B, we're all gonna be flexible during this time. Using pair shares where possible. So because we are virtual, we really shouldn't be spending an hour or an hour and a half, 2 hours just kind of listening to a lecture. So are there opportunities for you to utilize the breakout room feature? Now we have the feature within Zoom that individuals can move from breakout room to breakout room on their own. So how can you incorporate that into your classes as well?
Yeah, so keeping up this community and these different ways of staying connected with the students in the courses, there's lots of ways to get ongoing feedback and low stakes feedback from students. Some of these are, as Alexis is saying, whether they're in breakout rooms or pair share, or when you're just checking in with them informally, all of that is a form of feedback. Any sort of active learning activity where you're also finding out how students are learning, what they're doing. This is another sort of basic example of ways to get kind of ongoing feedback on how students are doing. You see on the slide here just an example of a minute paper form. That's a pretty common and low stakes way at the end of each class, if you had a Google form like this, that just asks students What have they learned? What are they confused about? What do they want to know more about? It's a good way to get a quick pulse on the class and to help you plan future classes, as well as to find out pretty quickly if there's a problem. You'll see here there's a question like, how did it go in Zoom? You can find out, if someone's having trouble technically or other things. But doing sort of routine things like this can really help keep a pulse on the class and keep the lines of communication open. If students know you value their feedback and then you're addressing their feedback kind of continuously, it's a great way to keep those norms that you hopefully set up with the beginning with the syllabus, like keep them going. I think we have a tendency to think, well, I said that 2 months ago, like how do we keep the conversation fresh and keep that through the thread of the course? It's October. It's a great time to do a more formal early feedback collecting. So again, in the handout, you'll see some resources on that. At the Box Center, we have template forms you can use for collecting early feedback. And just the process is here. You would plan what you want to collect and then administer it. And the important point is then really responding. So even if there's feedback that you can't really change, if suggestions that you can't really change about the course, it's a great moment to reset. Some of you are asking for this, but we can't change that, and here's why we're doing it this way, just as another moment to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page about what you're doing and why, what the goal is. And then, yeah, so I think we can go just thinking, given the challenging circumstances, how do we keep track of this feedback? And then inevitably, when things go wrong or there are challenges or things that are coming up that you didn't expect, what can you do? So we have developed this framework at the Box Center. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but as we shift to thinking about tackling some scenarios in breakout rooms, like what should you do when something comes up that you weren't expecting? And these are the 4 steps that we've thought of just to help break it down a little bit. So first is like, how do you react? And kind of managing and noticing your own reaction if something comes up that you weren't expecting. Then what are the steps you need to take to understand the situation? What sort of issues are at play? Who else might you need to talk to? Just kind of taking time to understand the problem. And then what would the short-term response be? And then what might a longer-term response be? And of course, with all teaching, it's always a process. So we're always thinking, what can we learn from this that will help us in the future as we're always reflecting about our practice as teachers. So what we're gonna do is, just given this kind of framework, we're going to put you into breakout rooms to discuss the specific scenarios. And you'll see here the assignments, and you also should see them in the handout. So first, I'll just say, if you look at part 2 of the handout, it says a little bit more about the scenarios. We've tried to, these are all based on real things that we've experienced or heard about this term. And we've tried to present sort of a range of issues, a range of scenarios that bring up the different kinds of issues that can be going on right now, given the pandemic and natural disasters and all of the terrible things that are happening right now that we're dealing with and our students are dealing with. So you see 4 questions in the handout, and then you see group assignments. So Cassie, I think we can go into breakout rooms.
Okay, so welcome back. And we will take some time to report out, but we did want to let you know that we will be taking notes of the highlights that you share with us from your group discussions. We will add those to the handout that you now have access to. And we will also be inserting into that handout our recommendations of how we think you should respond to these particular situations. So we'll add all of that. If you give us a couple of days, we'll make sure to add your highlights and also our own recommendations.
We don't have much time, but we'd like to hear just some quick highlights as much as we can from each scenario. So what is one thing you'd like to share about scenario 1? What should we do here?
My name's Dan Hawkins. I'm the CIO at the Divinity School. And, as an IT person, obviously, I jumped to some sort of solution for the technology problem, but my other members of our breakout group had many other good perspectives that led me to feel like, empathy and understanding the emotional impact of the situation the person was going through was probably one of the first reactions that should be kind of considered in these kind of scenarios. And then obviously working on the other technology solutions as well, but just that there's a wider impact going on here to the person in the situation.
Really good points there. Go ahead, Pamela.
Yeah, just this is interesting, right? For all of these, the range of like, is there a technical solution? Like, do we need to connect to resources versus, what other sort of more other kinds of support can we provide? And kind of navigating that line between the technical answer and what other empathy and other things we might need to think about.
Something that I really appreciate that was said was you acknowledge, as an IT person, my initial reaction. So when we think about that framework that Pamela presented of assessing your own reactions to it. So take a moment and assess, okay, what's my reaction and why am I having that reaction? I'm an IT person, so my initial thing is solve the technical problem. But then you also highlighted the importance of having a conversation with colleagues when you encounter these difficult situations, because they're going to bring that other perspective in, and understanding that, our instinct is to solve the problem, but then we also want to just acknowledge that there is a difficulty here. And I want to reference back to something that was said in the first morning session, was to make sure that we're not characterizing it as the student is the problem in this scenario, but instead it is the situation and the circumstances here that are the problem, and making sure we're responding to the student from that perspective. I had one question in the chat about resources that the university has in place. So there are certain offices within the university, especially on the student affairs side at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, that they try to be aware of where students are located, especially this semester, to be able to reach out to them to say, we are aware that there's a natural disaster that has happened. Is there a way that Harvard can be supportive? And I encourage you, especially on the undergraduate side, the resident deans and things, making sure that you're connecting with them, the student affairs office, the diversity and inclusion office at the college. But also when we talk about assessing the needs of your students, if you were to kind of create a survey that assessed technological needs, lab needs, that type of thing, you may also want to ask where they're physically located for the semester, so that you and your teaching staff can also keep track of that, so that you can be aware, okay, there's a hurricane coming to that area. I know that I have a student that's located there. Let me just check in with them. So again, taking the responsibility off of the student that they always have to come to you with something, but if there's a way for you to be proactive in that, then to take that step.
Yeah, and I love this comment in the chat here. Thank you, Kelly, about just checking what the student needs. And this scenario is purposely written. The student's not asking for an extension. They're not asking you about the midterm yet. So you might anticipate what kinds of things are coming up, but first starting with, what does the student need and how might you help there? Yeah, let's go to scenario 2. Do we have any volunteers to share some highlights from your discussion, or one important highlight?
I wanted to share a thought. I have to admit my group didn't actually get to discussing that. We had a great conversation about a number of things, but we didn't completely discuss that scenario. However, when I read the scenario, what I wondered myself was what things might be in place with regard to communication paths. I'm assuming that this student didn't like to speak because their parents might hear them, but if a course is really set up to be accessible in terms of ADA standards and things, I would assume there would be other methods that would be available. So I started down that path instead with a scenario, which I realized probably is not what you were after.
No, I think that's a great point. And this comes up in a few of them. What sort of things can be done in a written format or in a more asynchronous format if the class participation itself is problematic? And I think this brings up, you know, separate from the gender issues at play here, even just having an audience for any of your Zoom meetings. I have my children here, they might hear, you know, thinking about having an audience for your class. This has never happened before, right? Normally you go to class, you have your discussion, you come home. And what happens when these lines are blurred? What did others of you discuss here?
So we have a question in the chat about if students have ways to request equipment such as headphones to help with such a circumstance. So I think this is a place where definitely thinking about what are those questions you're asking at the very beginning to assess students' needs and concerns, because this could have been something that a student would have told you via some kind of survey in the very beginning of the semester where you were assessing needs and concerns that they would need a headphones. And so you could have reached out to Hewitt, reached out to student services to see, are there resources for students to request those things? Also, that there is the resource that students are able to kind of petition to live on campus. So is that something that this student may have wanted to tap into, that particular resource as well? So again, the importance of assessing those needs and concerns at the very beginning so that you're fully aware and can connect them with those that are available.
I believe that students can always reach out to Hewitt through this time. So that's a good thing to remember. Okay, scenario 3, everyone wants an extension. And I'll just address, these are all based on things that have come up in some way. They've been fictionalized for the purpose of the session, but they're based on core things that Alexis and I have been aware of this term. What did you all talk about here?
The first reaction for most of us was it would have been really great if this information was in the syllabus, and really underscoring how important it is to think about flexibility and for really every student and the different ways that they might do that. I think we also then talked about, like, why is this happening at this point in time? Is there something with the assignment that everybody is struggling with? Is there something with the timing that everybody is struggling with? How can we sort of tease apart the different aspects of this assignment that seem like a sort of unified cry for help in different ways is happening from the class? So just kind of digging into that. And though we talked about a lot of things I don't want to dominate, but we also really highlighted the importance of connecting students to their resources and networks, particularly their residential deans or their tutors and proctors, to make sure that they're getting all the support they need sort of in your class and outside of it.
Great, thank you so much. And there's a resource in the chat now specifically for that. Thank you.
Groups that looked at scenario 4, highlights of your discussion.
One of the things we talked about is what is it about participation that is so crucial to this course? And what does participation look like? Does it need to happen synchronously? Are there ways that we could build in substitutes or alternative paths to allow for the student to make up or going forward to engage fully with the class on the participation front? We also raised the vexing question of what would our response to this student's request be different if the student were protesting against Black Lives Matter instead of for? And how do we think just more broadly, whatever the reason is for the request, how do we think more broadly about equitably applying policies across students? It gets to the previous situation of, if you give an extension to one, do you need to give it to offer it to everyone?
Thank you. Thank you. So some things to really be mindful of, as you mentioned, I'm really glad that you got to kind of what about the participation. And, you know, also I would ask the question to the comment on the previous scenario, did you define this in the syllabus? So does the syllabus just say participation is 20%, but then doesn't give a definition to what participation looks like? Because participation could be, I'm you know, responding to discussion threads. I am turning in different essays. I'm coming to sections and engaging in that way, but I'm not actually in the live classes. So again, take a step back and say, for future, kind of going back to that framework Pamela mentioned where that last question was long-term planning. So your long-term step might be, in the future on my syllabi, I'm going to define what participation looks like. But then in the short term, how can we support the student, and really acknowledging that the priority is that the learning is happening And if we look at the assignments that the student has turned in and it's clear that the learning is still taking place, then really should we penalize them on the participation front if it's clear that the learning is happening and they're still keeping up with their activities. Things that we want to be mindful of in that first question on that framework of what are our own reactions. So really taking a step back, because what we don't want to do is, respond by saying, well, you really should focus on your studies right now. Because we have to acknowledge that seeing the option of choosing between activism and studies and seeing that as a simple decision is a privilege. So again, how are we assessing our own reactions to this, because we don't want to silence the student's activism. We also want to just check in, show some empathy, as was mentioned in the first scenario. How are we just kind of checking in, seeing how they're doing? I would also encourage periodically checking in with them, throughout the semester. And then again, this goes back to the assessing the needs and concerns of your students, because this is something you would have known that they were kind of in that area. So you may have already checked in with them just to see how they're doing. Also, even prior to this, did you check in with your students in general? We think back to when George Floyd was murdered and Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. Did we take the time, if you were teaching in that moment, to just check in with your students and say, I'm here to support and be flexible in that time? Other reactions before we move to scenario 5?
May I actually build on what Allison was saying and before about extensions? One thing to be aware of is that gets back to the point of why you need an extension policy in your syllabus. Once one starts giving extensions to lots of people on the grounds that because you gave extension to one, you can actually get a counter reaction when people said, I did all my work, I turned it in on time, now everyone else is getting extension. That also is unfair. So it rapidly becomes suboptimal for large stretches of the class. So just be aware that not actually, when it seems like a lot of people want extensions, that doesn't mean it's 100% of people, nor that 100% of people think they would gain.
Thank you for that. Yes. Okay, so we're going to go to scenario 5, groups that we're looking at scenario 5.
So our group 11, took a step at scenario 5, and I just want to give a shout out to the Bach fellow that was in our session, Sarah, who did such a great job at first, like kind of taking a step back. We did a quick inventory of what stood out to each of us, and the first thing that she said, and I don't want to ruin it, Sarah, so if you want to jump in and chime in, I definitely don't want to talk for you. I just want to give you a shout out for saying, how did I create the conditions for this one person to kind of have control over this group of assignment? How did I design this so that we've not set expectations about what counts as scholarship and what counts as making sure that we entertain different voices at the table, and not entertain, but include them. And so I think, that was a good step back. I think we also wanted to first and foremost follow up with Clarissa. This is an infuriating, for me personally, like kind of situation. And so like being able to register that, not over respond, but also wanting to say, like, what does the student want? How do we support the student and the learning? And then just making sure that we follow up with the entire class. I think Chelsea and I'm gonna get their name wrong, Laura, were in also again saying like, this might be happening other spaces. So we need to make sure we get a hold of the whole classroom. We have this kind of tone setting and also like recalibration conversation, which I thought was really helpful.
Thank you for that. So I'm glad that you all, really covered the what can we do in the future to be reframing this, but then also there's the what in the moment can we be doing. And I'm glad that you mentioned engaging the whole class. So this is one of those situations where you ask, is this a learning opportunity for everyone? And an opportunity also for you to think about, should I reframe this assignment? Because I myself, as the faculty member, didn't encourage my students to take into consideration the social context and all of the social issues that are related to the assignment. And so when we think about how can we use our classroom and our curriculum to ensure that we are graduating engaged citizens that are aware of systemic issues that are impacting our country so that they can go into their respective fields ready to think about things through this lens, And so it's so completely okay to go back to your course and say, hey, I want to reframe this assignment because I'm realizing I myself didn't encourage you to take these things. Here are some articles that I'm going to encourage everyone to read related to this assignment, and maybe adding a discussion thread related to those articles. Also, to Amanda's point, thinking, do I need to have a conversation with this particular student? One, about being aware that, racism does happen currently, but then also not overpowering a group, thinking about those group dynamics. Do we encourage our groups to have group contracts of how they're going to work together, how they're going to communicate with each other? And so again, maybe it's time we take that step back to have that conversation with the entire class, because as Amanda said, it may be these group dynamics could be happening in other groups, and maybe it's not manifesting itself related to identity, but they're still having these difficult group dynamics. But it definitely could be a learning opportunity with regard to social justice issues for the course.
We did have one question. Part of this moment is about, how do we honor Clarissa's requests to change groups as well, and wanting, and the back end work of us wanting to make a difference for the whole classroom, but at the same time not asking that student to then be like the example. So just,
Yes.
Is it okay to ask them to validate, not ask them to relive whatever happened, how their experiences are, but just make sure that they're okay and ask them what they want to see happen going forward, so that as you said in the previous scenario, that we're focusing on their learning, because this is just a lot already.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good point. We do not want to put the responsibility onto a student, especially a student from a marginalized identity, to have to teach, because you can make it a learning moment for all of your class, and then you run the risk that that student goes back into the group, and then that whole group is now looking to them to answer all of the questions and teach them more beyond the articles that you may have assigned for readings. So how do you set that tone? And again, checking in with the student to see what they would like to see. I would also, and I'll add this actually to the handout, a book related to restorative justice. And so this could be an opportunity of taking the approach from restorative justice, or there may be opportunity to meet with the group and have a discussion where Clarissa then may become comfortable re-entering that group once the other group members kind of acknowledge what happened and are prepared to move forward, and also understanding that moving forward means that they're not going to put the onus on Clarissa to teach them things. But I'll put a link to a reference related to restorative justice. So we won't get into scenario 6, but what we will commit to doing is that we will add into the document our recommendations for scenario 6. And then the groups that looked at scenario 6, if you want to send us some of your highlights that you would like to see captured in that document, then we will make sure to capture those.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our session today and exploring these important topics with us. We hope we've given you just a few more things to think about as we're exploring different foundational ideas, and as well as looking at real things that are happening now. We're all facing so much right now. We're all doing so much, but it's really great to connect and share and talk with this group about it. So as Alexa said, please share other resources, and we'll finalize this handout that you all have access to, and keep up these important conversations. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And we would encourage you to discuss these scenarios with your colleagues. So you have access to that handout now. Take these discussions into your team meetings and use the scenarios we provided you.